The aggregate demand curve is subject to shift if outside factors other than price level or output change. If the outside factor that changes causes an increase in aggregate demand, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. If the outside factor causes a decrease in aggregate demand, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. The determinants of the aggregate demand curve center around the four components of GDP. If there is a change in consumer spending, if there is a change in investment spending, if there is a change in government spending, or if there is a change in net export spending, the aggregate demand curve will either shift to the left or to the right, depending if there's a decrease or increase in aggregate demand. A table of the determinants of aggregate demand can be found on page 190 of your textbook. Let's first look at change in consumer spending. 4 different reasons would change consumer spending: consumer wealth, consumer expectations, debt of households, and taxes. Let's take a look at consumer wealth. If the real value of consumer wealth, for example, a rise in real estate or a rise in the stock market, might prompt consumers to purchase more goods and services. Therefore, this increase in wealth would cause an increase in aggregate demand, as evident on the aggregate demand curve. Thinking in reverse, if Americans' wealth has declined, perhaps because of a decline in the stock market or a decline in real estate values, that would have an opposite effect. That would cause a decrease in aggregate demand. Individuals would feel less comfortable spending because of their decrease of wealth, and therefore spend less in the economy. Let's look at consumer expectations. If we expect the economy to be booming, unemployment to be low, and in general prosperity to settle, then consumer expectations will encourage spending. That increase in spending would increase aggregate demand. If consumers are very negative about the economy, maybe they anticipate a great change in price level, maybe they expect unemployment to increase, or some other factor, then aggregate demand would decrease, or in other words, move to the left. Let's consider debt. If households take on a lot of debt, that means they have increased their consumption spending. That increase would cause aggregate demand to increase. Think of it as if people take on more mortgages, an example of debt, they'll buy more houses. Then we can also consider if households are taking on less debt. If they're taking on less debt, then consumption spending will decline, and hence aggregate demand would decline. Finally, we need to consider taxes. A tax on income would take away money consumers have to spend. The elimination of a tax on income would increase what consumers have to spend. Therefore, the introduction of taxes would decrease aggregate demand. The reduction of taxes would increase aggregate demand. Now let's take a look at how changes in investment spending would move the aggregate demand curve. First of all, let's think of interest rates. If real interest rates increase, that means investments are more expensive to undertake. Therefore, when interest rates increase, aggregate demand decreases. If interest rates decline, then that makes it cheaper to conduct investments. Therefore, aggregate demand would increase. We can also take a look at expected future business conditions as something that would impact aggregate demand. If firms are very positive about future business conditions and believe that they have the opportunity for much profit, they will invest, and therefore aggregate demand would increase. If firms have hesitation about the economy and think that economic conditions will deteriorate, then aggregate demand would decline. Technology will also impact aggregate demand. If there's some great new technology that would improve returns on investments, for example, a new piece of capital that makes communication even easier between plants, that would encourage investment spending and increase aggregate demand. We also have to consider how much capital is available. Let's say there's lots of extra factory space in a community. Well, then a business is less likely to invest in new physical capital. They'll just use the existing space. A glut of capacity for production or office space would cause a decrease in aggregate demand because there's no reason for investment spending. If capital is used up, if there's little business space, for example, if all shopping center space in a community is used up and another business wants to build a store in a community, they're going to have to invest. Hence, that would increase investment spending and increase aggregate demand. Taxes also have an effect on businesses. If businesses have an increase in taxes, it's going to affect their after-tax profits. Therefore, they would engage in less spending, and aggregate demand would decline. If we decrease taxes, that means the business gets to keep more of its profits, and hence aggregate demand would increase. Government spending is a pretty easy component and determinant of aggregate demand. Basically, if the government increases its purchases in the economy, aggregate demand increases or goes to the right. If a government decreases its purchasing in the economy, aggregate demand will decrease and move to the left. Finally, we have to consider how changes in net export spending would impact aggregate demand. We have to consider incomes abroad. If income increases abroad, that means more foreigners will be able to buy more finished goods and services. They may look to the United States for a source of new goods and services. Therefore, net exports would increase, hence increasing aggregate demand. Let's say a recession in Europe causes incomes abroad to decline. Europeans will not seek as many finished goods and services from the United States. Therefore, net exports would decline, and the aggregate demand curve would move to the left. Finally, we have to consider exchange rates. If the dollar depreciates, in other words, has a very low value, that will make it more likely for foreigners to buy American goods. So a low dollar value would increase American exports and hence increase aggregate demand. If the dollar appreciates and therefore it is more expensive to buy American goods and services, they will not buy as many American goods and services, and hence aggregate demand will decrease. Therefore, exchange rates also have an impact on aggregate demand.